In the early 1800s, the world claimed it had changed. New laws were written, treaties were signed, speeches were made in grand halls of power. The Atlantic slave trade, they said, was over.
But far from those halls, far from the ink on those papers, the ships were still sailing. At night, under false flags, across hidden routes, carrying human beings treated as cargo. This is not the story of how slavery ended. This is the story of how it refused to die.
Because while history books mark dates and declarations, the truth lived in the shadows, in the final decades when the trade became illegal, yet more desperate, more violent, and more secretive than ever before. These were the last years of the Atlantic slave trade, and they reveal something far darker than most people realize. By the early 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade had already reshaped the world. Over 12 million Africans had been forcibly taken from their homes. Entire regions were destabilized.
Generations were lost. European empires had grown rich. Plantations in the Americas had expanded. Global capitalism had taken root, built on stolen lives. But something was changing. Public opinion, especially in Europe, was beginning to shift. Religious movements condemned the trade. Former enslaved people told their stories. Economic systems began to evolve. In 1807, Britain officially abolished the slave trade. The United States followed shortly after. On paper, it looked like progress, but laws do not erase profit overnight, and the Atlantic slave trade was one of the most profitable systems the world had ever known. Here's the truth most documentaries rush past. When the slave trade became illegal, it did not slow down. In many places, it actually became more brutal. Why?
Because illegal trade has no rules, ship captains could no longer rely on inspections or legal protection. They packed more people into smaller spaces. They shortened voyages at any cost. They discarded the sick without hesitation. If a ship was caught, everything was lost. So captains took fewer chances and showed less mercy. This period created what historians now call the most violent phase of the Atlantic slave trade, and it unfolded almost entirely in secret. After abolition laws, the trade didn't disappear, it moved. Routes shifted south.
Instead of North America and the Caribbean, the focus turned toward Brazil and Cuba, where demand for enslaved labor remained enormous. Ships sailed under false identities. Spanish, Portuguese, and Brazilian traders exploited weak enforcement. Corruption greased every port. Even British merchants, publicly anti-slavery, quietly invested in illegal voyages. And African coastal intermediaries, trapped in cycles of violence and survival, were pulled deeper into the trade. A global system adapted, because when money is powerful enough, morality becomes optional. It's easy to speak in statistics. Millions transported, thousands of ships, centuries of trade. But every number was a human life. A child separated from their mother, a village emptied overnight, a language lost, a future stolen. During the final years of the trade, captives often had less chance of survival than ever before. They were moved quickly, fed less.
Treated as disposable, because if a ship was intercepted by patrols, the human cargo became evidence, and evidence could be thrown overboard. This was the unspoken reality of the post-abolition era. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Atlantic slave trade was officially illegal across much of the world, yet tens of thousands of Africans were still being trafficked every year. So the question is no longer why slavery existed. The real question is this: how did the trade survive when the world claimed it had ended? Who protected it? Who profited from its final years? And what finally brought it down, not in words, but in reality? When governments outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, they believed law would defeat profit. They were wrong. The trade didn't collapse, it evolved. What emerged in its place was something far more dangerous, an international criminal network that stretched across oceans. Former legal merchants became smugglers. Respected shipbuilders secretly redesigned vessels. Insurance companies found ways to look away. Entire ports depended on the trade, even after it was banned. Because abolition threatened wealth, and wealth has always known how to protect itself. Illegal slave ships were different. They were smaller, faster, lighter. Known as clippers, these vessels sacrificed comfort for speed. Extra sails were added. Cargo holds were modified. Below deck, there was barely room to sit upright. The goal was simple: outrun patrol ships. Survival was not the priority. Delivery was. If captives survived the crossing, profit followed. If they didn't, the next voyage would replace them. This was human trafficking optimized for efficiency. Britain positioned itself as the moral leader of abolition. The Royal Navy formed the West Africa Squadron, tasked with intercepting illegal slave ships. On paper, it was a massive operation. In reality, enforcement was weak. The African coastline was vast, patrol ships were few, communication was slow. Even when ships were captured, the consequences were limited. Captains bribed officials, courts delayed cases. Ships were often returned under new ownership. A single successful voyage could fund years of risk. The trade adapted faster than the law ever could. The final years of the Atlantic slave trade were not run by outlaws alone. They were supported by bankers who financed voyages, politicians who ignored enforcement, plantation owners who demanded labor, governments that benefited indirectly. Even nations that publicly condemned slavery quietly consumed its profits. Sugar, cotton, coffee. These products fueled economies while the suffering behind them was hidden from view. Abolition did not end exploitation, it pushed it out of sight. Africa was not a passive backdrop. Coastal regions became battlegrounds of survival. Some leaders resisted the trade, others were coerced. Some were trapped in systems already destroyed by centuries of violence. European demand had reshaped political structures, created dependency, and normalized human exchange. By the time abolition arrived, the damage was already deeply embedded. The final years of the Atlantic slave trade did not create chaos, they revealed it. As the trade went deeper underground, the suffering intensified. But something else was growing as well: resistance. On ships, on shore, in whispered plans and desperate acts. In Part 3, we step inside the holds of illegal slave ships and listen to the voices history tried to silence. Because the final years of the Atlantic slave trade were not only about greed, they were also about defiance. Numbers tell one story, stories tell another. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Atlantic slave trade was illegal, but captives were still being crammed into ships day after day. Imagine a ship's hold, pitch black, suffocating air, bodies stacked shoulder to shoulder. Rats scurry, disease spreads, and the smell of unwashed humanity is overpowering. Below deck, captives whispered, cried, or prayed. Some sang songs of home, hoping someone would hear them. Some plotted escape, though the chances were slim. Some simply clung to life one breath at a time. This was not just transportation, it was a test of endurance, courage, and despair. Children were not spared. Infants wrapped in rags, crying endlessly, mothers clinging desperately, fathers powerless to protect them. Entire families were ripped apart before the voyage even began. When captives reached the hold, the bonds of kinship were a memory. Yet, even in this darkness, humans resisted. Some sang lullabies to comfort children. Some told stories of home to keep hope alive. The human spirit, fragile yet unbreakable, endured. Not all captives remained passive. Secret revolts erupted on ships, chains were broken, shouts echoed in the holds. Some ships were taken over, forcing the crew to retreat or surrender. Even small acts counted, refusing food, deliberately slowing work, hiding tools. These acts of defiance were dangerous, punishable by death, yet they persisted. Resistance became a statement. We are not just cargo, we are human. Life above deck contrasted sharply with the horrors below. Captains logged profits, not deaths. Sailors enforced rules with iron hands. Some justified brutality as necessary discipline. Yet not all were indifferent. Some crew members documented suffering in secret journals, describing the despair and courage of captives. These accounts, rare as they are, survive today, offering a window into lives that history often ignores. For captives, the journey was not only physical, but psychological. Fear, uncertainty, and trauma created a liminal space where time stretched endlessly, and hope became both a lifeline and a temptation to despair. For crew, the psychological toll was also significant. Some became numb to suffering, others questioned morality. Some sought redemption by secretly helping captives, at great personal risk. The ship itself became a floating microcosm of the world's moral contradictions. As these ships sailed across the Atlantic, they carried more than humans. They carried stories of courage, despair, and resistance. They carried the seeds of abolition movements. They carried evidence of a trade that refused to die. In Part 4, we will explore the revolts, abolition movements, and the political forces that tried, and sometimes failed, to stop this illegal empire.
Even in the darkest years of the Atlantic slave trade, humanity refused to surrender. Across the Atlantic, captives and free people alike found ways to fight back. On the ships, whispers became plans. On the coasts, communities resisted raids. In Europe and the Americas, abolitionists raised their voices louder than ever. The final decades of the trade were marked not just by greed and brutality, but by courage, defiance, and the unwavering belief in freedom. Revolts on ships became increasingly common. Captives seized weapons hidden in cargo, shouted commands to each other in secret codes, struggled to take control of the ship itself. Though most uprisings were suppressed, they terrified the crew and traders alike. They revealed that enslaved people were not mere property. They were human beings, willing to risk everything for freedom. Some ships never completed their voyages because of these revolts. Some captains lost their lives. Some captives, against all odds, escaped to freedom. Across the Atlantic, abolitionists were gaining momentum. In Britain, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade had already been working for decades. Public opinion shifted through newspapers, pamphlets, and lectures. Formerly enslaved individuals like Olaudah Equiano told their stories, inspiring outrage and action. In the United States, abolitionists faced political pushback, but their voices grew louder. The moral and ethical argument against slavery was no longer hidden. It became a global conversation. Governments struggled to balance morality with economics. Even as laws were passed, plantation owners, merchants, and corrupt officials found ways to profit. Naval patrols intercepted some ships, but enforcement was inconsistent. Bribes, false papers, and hidden routes allowed trade to continue. The Atlantic slave trade in its final decades became a game of cat and mouse. Illegal yet unstoppable. Moral law versus monetary greed. African coastal societies were caught in the middle. Some leaders resisted slave raiders. Others were forced to comply under threat of violence or economic collapse. Communities developed survival strategies, hiding people, negotiating with traders, or relocating entirely. These decades revealed a complex moral landscape. No one was entirely innocent, yet countless acts of courage and resistance persisted. By the 1830s and 1840s, the Atlantic slave trade was still active, but cracks were appearing. Patrols were more effective, international cooperation increased, the risks for traders escalated. The final collapse of the Atlantic slave trade was approaching. In Part 5, we explore how the trade finally ended, the forces behind its downfall, and the cost it left behind for millions of lives and entire continents. By the 1830s, the Atlantic slave trade was under unprecedented pressure. Laws against slavery were no longer symbolic, they were enforced with increasing determination. The Royal Navy intensified patrols along the African coast. International treaties allowed cooperation across nations. Ports became monitored, and corrupt officials faced consequences. For the first time in decades, illegal traders began to fear capture, and not just for their ships, but for their freedom. The trade, once wildly profitable, became a dangerous gamble. Ships risked seizure, captains risked imprisonment or execution. Insurance companies stopped covering illegal voyages. Even plantations began to adapt. New labor systems emerged. Mechanization and wage labor began to reduce dependence on enslaved Africans. The once unstoppable system was cracking under pressure. Several pivotal moments marked the trade's collapse. British West Africa Squadron intercepted more ships than ever before. Brazilian legislation 1850 formally outlawed the trade under threat of naval blockade. International cooperation increased between Britain, France, and the United States. Despite these successes, the trade lingered in hidden networks, proving that even with enforcement, greed and secrecy were powerful allies. The human cost of these final years was staggering. Tens of thousands of Africans were still trafficked illegally. Mortality rates soared on crowded ships. Entire families were still torn apart. Yet these final decades also showcased unmatched courage. Revolts continued at sea. Underground networks helped escape. Former captives became vocal advocates for abolition. The end of the trade did not erase suffering, it merely stopped its expansion. The collapse of the Atlantic slave trade teaches us a harsh truth. Laws alone cannot change human behavior. Profit often outlasts morality. Courage and resistance matter, even against overwhelming odds. The final years exposed a system that refused to die, and a world that had to fight for morality over money. We conclude by exploring the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade, its impact on modern societies, and the enduring stories of those who resisted, survived, and shaped history. The Atlantic slave trade officially ended in the mid-19th century. Ships no longer carried human cargo across the oceans. Ports were closed. Laws were enforced. But the shadows of this trade did not vanish. Entire societies were transformed forever. Families were destroyed, generations lost, communities uprooted. And yet, the echoes of courage and resilience survived, carried by those who endured, resisted, and rebuilt. The world learned a harsh lesson. Human greed can perpetuate suffering long after laws are written. But the human spirit can endure far longer than oppression. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is still visible today. Economies were built on stolen labor. Racial and social hierarchies were entrenched. Cultural displacement and diaspora reshaped continents. Yet out of tragedy came resistance movements, cultural resilience, and communities that thrived despite centuries of exploitation. Understanding these final decades is crucial to understanding the modern world. Stories of courage, resilience, and defiance remain alive through oral histories passed through generations, diaries and journals of former captives, abolitionist writings and reports. These voices remind us that even in the darkest moments, humans refused to be silenced. They resisted in ways large and small, and they shaped the outcome of history
long before governments enforced morality. What can we take from the last years of the Atlantic slave trade? Moral courage matters. One voice can inspire change. Systems of oppression adapt. Laws alone are not enough. Humanity endures. Even in the most brutal circumstances, hope survives. The final years remind us the fight against injustice requires persistence, vigilance, and courage. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean at dawn. Ships glide across the waves. Ghosts of the past whisper in the wind. But among the shadows, there is light, the light of those who survived, who resisted, who refused to be reduced to cargo. History may remember dates, laws, and treaties, but it is the courage of the people, the captives, the resistors, the abolitionists, that truly defines this story. The Atlantic slave trade may have ended, but its lessons endure. Human greed can be powerful, but the human spirit is stronger. And in that truth lies hope.